The dusty wind carried the distinct clanking of the approaching stagecoach, drawing the attention of everyone in Gonzales, Texas, on that sweltering summer day in 1875. Jacob Thornton shifted uneasily on his worn leather boots as he stood at the edge of the small but bustling town, his calloused hands clutching a crumpled letter that had traveled across half the country to reach him. The paper was thin from countless readings, the ink faded at the creases where he'd folded and unfolded it, studying the delicate handwriting of a woman he'd never met but had agreed to marry. The stagecoach rattled to a stop, dust billowing around it like a golden cloud in the afternoon sun. Jacob swallowed hard, pushing back the brim of his hat as the door swung open. He'd been expecting one passenger, his mail-order bride from Boston, but when two women emerged, one significantly older than the other, confusion creased his sun-weathered face. The younger woman, perhaps 23 or 24, stepped down first. Her auburn hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet, her traveling dress rumpled but of good quality. She turned immediately to assist the older woman, whose silver hair and lined face spoke of at least 7 decades of life. "Mr. Thornton," the younger woman called, her eyes scanning the small crowd that had gathered to witness the arrival of the stagecoach and Jacob's long-awaited bride. Jacob stepped forward, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Miss Rose Ainsworth," he confirmed, his voice cracking slightly with nervousness. The woman nodded, a hesitant smile crossing her features. "Yes, and this is my mother, Margaret Ainsworth. I know you weren't expecting her, but I couldn't leave her behind. She's all the family I have." Jacob glanced between the two women, noting the worried crease between Rose's brows and the dignified yet anxious posture of her mother. The older woman stood as straight as her aged back would allow, clutching a small carpet bag with white-knuckled hands. Several onlookers exchanged whispers. Jacob could feel the weight of their stares and knew what they were thinking, that he'd send the old woman back on the next stage, that no hard-working rancher needed another mouth to feed, especially one that couldn't contribute to the difficult work of maintaining a homestead. But Jacob Thornton had buried both his parents before his 20th birthday and had spent the last 8 years of his life in a lonely house that echoed with silence. He knew what it meant to be family, to be loyal, to stand by those you loved. "Miss Ainsworth," he said, looking directly at Rose, then shifting his gaze to her mother, Mrs. Ainsworth. "There's room for both of you at my ranch. I wouldn't dream of separating a family." The relief that washed over Rose's face was immediate and profound. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she murmured, "Thank you, Mr. Thornton." Mrs. Ainsworth's thin lips curved into a grateful smile. "You are most kind, young man." The station master began unloading their trunks and Jacob moved to help. "My wagon's just over there," he said, nodding toward a sturdy vehicle hitched to 2 patient bay horses. "It's not a fancy rig, but it'll get us home comfortable enough." As Jacob loaded their belongings, Rose stood close to her mother, their hands linked. "I told you he seemed like a good man in his letters," she whispered. "Yes, dear, but letters can deceive. We shall see what kind of man he truly is," Mrs. Ainsworth replied softly, her wise eyes studying their future son-in-law as he worked. The wagon ride to Jacob's ranch was filled with polite but stilted conversation, as all three tried to navigate the strange waters of their new arrangement. Jacob pointed out landmarks as they left the town behind, explaining the lay of the land and the boundaries of his property. "It's not the biggest spread in Texas," he admitted, "but it's good land. My father chose well when he settled here." "How long has your family been in Texas?" Rose inquired, genuinely interested. "Since '45, when Texas was still its own republic." "My pa came from Tennessee looking for a fresh start. Built the house himself, added onto it twice. It's solid, keeps out the rain and the cold." Jacob's voice carried pride. "And your mother?" Mrs. Ainsworth asked. A shadow crossed Jacob's face. "Followed a year later with me in tow. I was just a baby then. She passed when I was 19, consumption." Pa followed her less than a year later. Some said it was his heart giving out, but I always believed he just couldn't bear to be without her. Rose's hand fluttered to her throat. I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago, Jacob said, though the set of his shoulders suggested the wound wasn't entirely healed. As they crested a gentle hill, Jacob's ranch came into view, a modest but well-maintained house with a broad porch, a large barn, corrals, and several outbuildings. A small creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods offering welcome shade. It's lovely, Rose breathed, and she meant it. After the cramped confines of their Boston apartment, the open space and natural beauty of the ranch were breathtaking. It's home, Jacob replied simply. Or at least, I hope it will be for you both. The first days at the ranch were an adjustment for everyone. Rose, accustomed to city living, found herself learning to cook on a wood-burning stove and carry water from the pump. Mrs. Ainsworth, despite her age, insisted on contributing and took over mending and some of the lighter household tasks. Jacob, for his part, was both bemused and impressed by the Ainsworth women's determination. He had lived alone for so long that sharing his space was strange, but not unwelcome. The house, which had stood silent for years except for his solitary movements, now echoed with conversation and occasional laughter. A week after their arrival, Jacob found Rose struggling with the washboard behind the house, her hands red and raw from the harsh soap. Here, he said, kneeling beside her and demonstrating a better technique. Like this, saves your hands some. Rose watched his strong, capable hands and felt a flutter in her stomach. You know how to do laundry, Jacob shrugged. Been on my own a long time. Had to learn all sorts of things no one would have taught me otherwise. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. Then Rose smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. Thank you, Mr. Thornton, Jacob, he corrected gently. If we're to be married, you should call me Jacob. Jacob, she repeated, his name soft on her lips. That evening at dinner, Mrs. Ainsworth watched the two young people with shrewd eyes. She noticed how Jacob ensured Rose's plate was filled first, how he listened attentively when she spoke, and how her daughter's cheeks flushed whenever their hands accidentally touched while passing dishes. Mr. Thornton, she said, when do you intend to make my daughter an honest woman? Mother, Rose exclaimed, mortified. Jacob cleared his throat. I thought perhaps this Sunday if the preacher's available, but only if that suits Miss Ainsworth. Rose looked up, surprise evident in her expression. So soon? Unless you'd prefer to wait, Jacob added quickly. I know this isn't conventional. We're still strangers in many ways, Mrs. Ainsworth sniffed. Conventions exist for a reason. Two unmarried people living under the same roof invites gossip. Yes, but Rose began, Jacob interrupted gently. Your mother's right about the gossip. Folks in town are already talking, but that's not why I suggested Sunday. He took a deep breath. I suggested it because I've enjoyed getting to know you this past week. Rose, you're kind and strong, and I think we could build a good life together, but I won't rush you if you're not ready. Rose studied his face, finding only sincerity there. Sunday would be fine, she said softly. The wedding was a simple affair at the small white church in Gonzales. The entire town turned out, partly to witness the union and partly to satisfy their curiosity about the mail-order bride and her elderly mother who had caused such a stir. Rose wore her best dress, a soft blue that complemented her auburn hair, which she wore loose beneath a small wreath of wildflowers Jacob had surprised her with that morning. Jacob, clean-shaven and dressed in a suit that had belonged to his father, stood tall beside her as they exchanged vows. Mrs. Ainsworth dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief throughout the ceremony, particularly when Jacob promised to cherish and protect Rose till death do us part, his voice unwavering and sure. The wedding celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with neighbors bringing food and music. As twilight descended, lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Jacob and Rose shared their first dance as husband and wife beneath the stars, their movements awkward at first but growing more comfortable as they held each other. "Are you happy?" Jacob whispered as they swayed to the fiddle music. Rose looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. "I'm not unhappy," she answered honestly. "I think happiness might take time." Jacob nodded, accepting her answer. "I'll wait," he promised. Later, as the guests began to depart, Mrs. Ainsworth approached Jacob. "I'll be sleeping in the small room off the kitchen tonight," she informed him. Jacob flushed, understanding her meaning. "Mrs. Ainsworth, I want you to know that I respect your daughter." "I won't." The older woman patted his arm. "You're a good man, Jacob Thornton. I can see that now. But you're also her husband and she's your wife. Respect is important, but so is building a marriage." With those cryptic words, she moved away, leaving Jacob speechless. That night, when they were finally alone in the bedroom that was now theirs, an awkward silence fell between them. Rose sat at the edge of the bed, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "I can sleep in the barn if you'd prefer," Jacob offered, standing by the door. Rose looked up, surprised. "The barn? But why would you do that?" "I don't want to make you uncomfortable. This is all happening so fast and we're still getting to know each other." Rose considered his words, touched by his consideration. "I appreciate that, Jacob, but this is your home, our home now. And you're right, we are still learning about each other, but I think maybe that's how it happens, day by day." Jacob crossed the room slowly and sat beside her, careful to leave space between them. "I meant what I said in my vows today, Rose. I'll be a good husband to you. Patient and kind, I won't ever force anything on you that you're not ready for." Rose reached out hesitantly and took his hand. "I know, that's why I agreed to marry you even though we'd only exchanged letters. There was something in your words that felt true." The summer gave way to fall, and with it came a change in their relationship. Working side by side each day, sharing meals and talking late into the evenings, Jacob and Rose developed a deep friendship that slowly blossomed into something more. Mrs. Ainsworth watched with satisfaction as stolen glances became lingering touches, and polite conversation transformed into intimate discussions about hopes and dreams. One crisp October morning, Jacob found Rose at the creek, washing clothes. The sunlight filtered through the golden cottonwood leaves, casting dappled shadows across her face as she worked. "You're beautiful," he said simply, the words escaping before he could stop them. Rose looked up, a blush creeping across her cheeks. "Jacob, I'm covered in soap suds and my hair's a mess." He crouched beside her, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "Still beautiful." Their eyes locked, and this time neither looked away. Jacob leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull back, but Rose met him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, questioning, a tentative exploration of new territory. When they parted, Rose's eyes remained closed for a moment, as though savoring the experience. When she opened them, Jacob was watching her with such tenderness that her heart skipped a beat. "I think," she whispered, "I might be falling in love with my husband." Jacob's smile was brilliant. "That's fortunate, because I've been in love with my wife for quite some time now." The next morning at breakfast, Mrs. Ainsworth noticed immediately that something had changed. There was a new ease between them, a quiet intimacy in the way they moved around each other. When Jacob reached for the coffee pot at the same time as Rose and their hands brushed, neither pulled away. Instead, their fingers intertwined briefly before Jacob let go with a smile. "Well, Mrs. Ainsworth declared, setting down her fork. "It's about time." Rose blushed furiously. "Mother, don't mother me, child. I'm old, not blind. You two have been dancing around each other for months." Jacob chuckled, the sound warm and relaxed. "You're a wise woman, Mrs. Ainsworth." "Margaret," she corrected. "I think it's high time you started calling me Margaret, son." As winter approached, the ranch became a true home for all three of them. Mrs. Ainsworth Margaret had transformed the small sitting room with handmade quilts and cushions. Rose had planted a late kitchen garden that promised fresh vegetables, even as the weather cooled. And Jacob, who had maintained the ranch functionally but sparingly during his years alone, found himself making improvements he'd long neglected, fixing the loose step on the porch, adding shelves in the kitchen, reinforcing the roof before the winter storms. "You're nesting," Margaret observed one evening as Jacob installed a rocking chair on the porch. "Just making things more comfortable," he replied, though he couldn't deny the truth in her words. For the first time in years, the ranch felt like a home worth investing in, worth building upon for the future. That future, however, seemed threatened when Margaret fell ill just before Christmas. A persistent cough developed into a fever that left her weak and bed-bound. The local doctor was summoned, but his diagnosis was grim. "Her lungs are failing her," he told Jacob and Rose privately outside Margaret's room. "At her age, there's not much to be done except keep her comfortable." Rose pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. Jacob immediately wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "How long?" he asked the doctor quietly. "Hard to say. Could be weeks, could be days. Winter's the hardest time for the elderly." After the doctor left, Rose collapsed into Jacob's arms, her tears soaking through his shirt. "I can't lose her, Jacob. She's all I have left." Jacob held her tightly, his own heart heavy. "You have me now, too," he reminded her gently, "and we'll do everything we can for your mother." Over the next days, Jacob and Rose took turns sitting with Margaret, ensuring she was never alone. Jacob rearranged his work schedule to be present more, delegating tasks to his ranch hand, Roberto, who had worked for the Thornton family since Jacob was a boy. Rose read to her mother from her favorite books, while Jacob surprised them both with his ability to play the harmonica, a skill he'd learned during lonely evenings before they arrived. Margaret seemed to rally under their devoted care, her cough lessening and her appetite improving slightly. On Christmas Eve, a gentle snow fell outside, unusual for Gonzales but welcome for the holiday spirit it brought. Inside, Jacob had decorated a small pine tree with handmade ornaments and candles. Margaret insisted on being helped to a chair by the fire to participate in the festivities. "It's the most beautiful Christmas I can remember," she said, wrapped in quilts despite the fire's warmth. Rose knelt beside her chair, resting her head on her mother's lap as she had done as a child. "We'll have many more," she promised, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. Jacob, watching the scene, felt a fierce protectiveness wash over him. In just a few months, these two women had become his world. The thought of losing Margaret, of seeing Rose heartbroken, was unbearable. Later that night, after Margaret had been settled back in bed and Rose had fallen into an exhausted sleep beside him, Jacob slipped out of the house and into the barn. There, in the quiet darkness broken only by the occasional snort of a horse, he knelt and prayed for the first time since his parents' deaths. "Please," he whispered, "don't take her yet. Not when Rose is just beginning to be happy here. Give us more time together, all three of us." Whether by divine intervention or Margaret's own resilience, she survived not only Christmas but the entire winter. By spring, while still frail, she was strong enough to sit on the porch for hours, watching as Jacob and Rose worked together in the fields and garden. "You know," she said one afternoon as Rose brought her a cup of tea, "I was terrified when we first came here." Rose sat beside her, surprised. "You never showed it." "Of course not. I had to be strong for you. But I was afraid Jacob would turn us away when he saw me, that you'd be forced to choose between your mother and your future husband." Rose took her mother's hand, noting how thin and paper-like the skin had become. "I wouldn't have stayed without you." "I know, dear. That's why I was afraid." But Jacob proved to be a better man than most. When he said there was room for both of us, I knew he was someone special. Rose followed her mother's gaze to where Jacob was mending a fence, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms browned by the sun. As though sensing their attention, he looked up and waved. "I love him, Mother," Rose admitted quietly. Margaret smiled. "I know that too, and he adores you. I can rest easy knowing you found each other." As spring bloomed into summer, celebrating their first year together, Rose discovered she was expecting a child. She shared the news with Jacob one evening as they walked along the creek, the setting sun painting the water in hues of gold and pink. Jacob stopped in his tracks, staring at her in wonder. "A baby, our baby," Rose nodded, her hands unconsciously moving to her still flat stomach. "The doctor confirmed it today when I went into town for supplies." Jacob let out a whoop of joy that startled a flock of birds from a nearby tree. Then he scooped Rose into his arms, spinning her around before setting her gently back on her feet. "Careful," she laughed. "I'm in a delicate condition, remember." "I'll be the most careful man in all of Texas," he vowed, then dropped to his knees before her, pressing his ear to her stomach as though he might hear the tiny life growing within. Rose threaded her fingers through his hair, her heart full to bursting. "Are you happy?" she asked, echoing his question from their wedding night. Jacob looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Happier than I ever thought possible." When they shared the news with Margaret that evening, the older woman clasped her hands together in prayer. "Thank you, Lord, for letting me live to see this day." Jacob crossed the room to kneel beside her chair. "You'd better plan on sticking around even longer," he told her firmly. "This child is going to need his grandmother." Margaret cupped his cheek with her weathered hand. "His." "Or hers," Jacob amended with a grin. "I'm not particular, so long as the baby and Rose are healthy." As Rose's pregnancy progressed, Jacob became increasingly protective, taking on more of the household chores despite her protests. Margaret, too, found renewed energy, knitting tiny garments and sharing wisdom from her own experiences as a mother. The ranch prospered that year, with a good harvest and healthy calves that promised future security. Jacob hired an additional ranch hand, Tom Wilson, a young man eager to learn and dependable in his work. This allowed Jacob more time at home, particularly as Rose entered her final months. "You're hovering," Rose accused one October afternoon as Jacob adjusted her shawl for the third time in an hour. "I'm caring for my wife and child," he countered, dropping a kiss on her forehead. Margaret chuckled from her corner where she was finishing a baby blanket. "Let the man fuss, Rose. It's his right as a father to be." The baby, a healthy boy they named James after Jacob's father, was born on a clear November morning just as the sun was rising. Dr. Peterson, who had ridden out to the ranch the previous evening when Rose's labor began, pronounced mother and child perfectly healthy. Jacob, who had paced the parlor all night, nearly collapsed with relief when the doctor finally invited him in to see his family. Rose, tired but radiant, cradled their son in her arms. "Would you like to hold your son, Mr. Thornton?" she asked, her voice soft with exhaustion and joy. Jacob approached the bed with reverence, accepting the tiny bundle with trembling hands. "Hello, James," he whispered, tracing a gentle finger over the baby's downy head. "I'm your pa." Margaret, who had assisted throughout the birth despite her own fragile health, watched from a chair by the bed, her eyes bright with tears. "He looks like you, Jacob." Jacob looked up, his face transformed by a love so profound it was almost painful. "He has Rose's nose, I think, and her spirit, too, coming into the world so strong and determined." As winter settled over the ranch once more, the Thornton household adjusted to life with a newborn. Nights were interrupted by James's hungry cries, but neither Jacob nor Rose complained. Each feeding, each diaper change, each tiny milestone was celebrated. Margaret, though increasingly frail, found joy in holding her grandson during the day, singing him the same lullabies she had once sung to Rose. And Rose, watching her mother with her son, treasured these moments all the more, knowing they were precious and finite. On Christmas Eve, 2 years after Margaret and Rose had first arrived in Gonzales, the family gathered around the fire much as they had that first year. James, now a month old, slept peacefully in a cradle Jacob had crafted by hand. "I have something for you," Jacob said to Rose, retrieving a small package from behind the Christmas tree. Rose unwrapped it carefully to find a delicate silver locket. Inside was a tiny portrait of Margaret on one side and James on the other. "So you'll always have them close to your heart," Jacob explained. Rose's eyes filled with tears as she fastened the locket around her neck. "It's perfect," she whispered, leaning in to kiss him tenderly. Margaret watched them from her chair, a serene smile on her face. "I have a gift for you both as well," she said. "Though it's nothing you can unwrap." They turned to her expectantly. "My gift is my blessing," she continued, "and my gratitude. When we came here, I was afraid we were imposing on a stranger's charity. Instead, we found a home and a family." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "Jacob, you didn't just make room for an old woman in your house, you made room for her in your heart. And Rose, my darling girl, you've become the woman I always knew you could be: strong, loving, a wonderful mother." Jacob crossed the room to kneel beside Margaret's chair, taking her frail hand in his strong one. "You're not just Rose's mother," he said earnestly. "Your family, my family. There was never any question of not making room for you." 5 years later, the Thornton ranch had expanded to include not only more land but more family. James, now a sturdy 5-year-old with his father's eyes and his mother's quick smile, had been joined by a 3-year-old sister named Elizabeth, after Rose's grandmother. Margaret, defying the doctor's predictions, had lived to see both her grandchildren born and to celebrate her 80th birthday, surrounded by the family that had grown from a chance beginning when a mail-order bride arrived with her elderly mother and a cowboy said, "There's room for both of you." On a warm spring evening, Jacob and Rose sat together on the porch swing, watching as Margaret told stories to James and Elizabeth on a quilt spread beneath the old oak tree. The children's laughter carried on the breeze, a sound that never failed to make Jacob's heart swell with pride and gratitude. "You ever think about how different our lives might have been if you'd sent us away that day?" Rose asked, her head resting comfortably on Jacob's shoulder. Jacob tightened his arm around her. "I couldn't have done it," he said simply. "The moment I saw you step off that stagecoach, something inside me knew you were meant to be here, both of you." Rose smiled, remembering her nervousness on that dusty afternoon 8 years ago. "I was so afraid you'd be angry when you saw Mother. The advertisement said wife wanted, not wife and mother-in-law. Best package deal I ever got," Jacob teased, dropping a kiss on her temple. "Besides, look at them now." He nodded toward Margaret and the children. Elizabeth was curled in her grandmother's lap, while James acted out what appeared to be a dramatic cowboy scene. "We've been blessed," Rose agreed softly. As twilight descended and fireflies began to dot the darkening yard, Jacob reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The lonely years before Rose and Margaret arrived seemed like another lifetime, now a faded memory compared to the vibrant reality of family love that filled his days. When he'd placed that advertisement for a mail-order bride, he'd been seeking companionship, perhaps eventually affection. What he'd found instead was a love so deep and true, it had transformed not just his life, but his understanding of what family meant. It wasn't about blood relations or legal ties. It was about making room in your heart and home for those who needed it, about building something together that was stronger than any one person could create alone. As the first stars appeared in the Texas sky, Jacob Thornton gave silent thanks for the twist of fate that had brought not one, but 2 remarkable women into his life that summer day in 1875, and for the simple truth that had guided every day since. There's always room for family.